The summer air was thick with the scent of hay as I stepped onto the old farmstead. It had been years since I last set foot here, but nothing had really changed, except for the people. My brother greeted me with a strong handshake, his wife with a warm smile. And then there was him, Daniel, my nephew. The last time I had seen him, he was just a lanky teenager, awkward and full of boyish energy. Now he stood before me, taller, stronger, with an air of quiet confidence. His eyes held something I couldn't quite place, something that made me pause for a second too long. "Uncle, it's good to have you back," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. Over the next few days, I settled into farm life again, helping with small tasks, reliving childhood memories. Daniel was always around, offering help, making conversation. He had a way of making the simplest things feel meaningful. Whether we were fixing the old fence or stacking hay behind the barn, our conversations flowed effortlessly. One afternoon, as we repaired a broken gate, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at me. "You ever miss this place?" I hesitated before answering. "Sometimes. But life moves on." "Yeah," he nodded, "but some things stay the same." I wasn't sure what he meant, but there was a weight in his voice, a knowing look in his eyes that made my stomach tighten. That evening, I found myself thinking about him more than I should. There was nothing wrong, nothing inappropriate. Yet there was something unspoken between us. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into casual glances and friendly gestures. But then there was that moment behind the barn. It had been a long day, the sun setting in a fiery glow. Daniel and I sat on a bale of hay, talking about nothing and everything. "You know," he said, staring at the horizon, "I always wondered what it would be like if you never left." I chuckled. "You were just a kid back then." "Still," he shrugged, "I remember more than you think." His words lingered, hanging in the warm evening air. I felt an unease I couldn't quite name. I wanted to change the subject, to dismiss the thought creeping into my mind. But when I looked at him, really looked, I knew this wasn't just nostalgia. I stood up quickly, brushing the dust from my hands. "We should head back," I said. He watched me for a long second before nodding. "Yeah, we should." As we walked back to the house, I felt it, an invisible line drawn between us. A line I had no intention of crossing. The following days were different. I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, but the shift was undeniable. Conversations were laced with an unspoken awareness, lingering glances lasted a second too long, and silence carried a weight neither of us acknowledged. I kept my distance, staying busy with the work that needed to be done. Yet, Daniel was always there, offering help, sharing a joke, making it impossible to ignore his presence. His confidence was unsettling, his ease around me almost deliberate. One evening, just as the sky darkened, I was stacking firewood near the barn when I heard his footsteps behind me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone casual but direct. I forced a laugh. "Just keeping busy." He stepped closer, too close. "You don't have to." There was something in his voice, assurance, maybe even challenge. I turned to face him, and in that moment, everything was too quiet. His expression was unreadable, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't willing to give. "This isn't right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why not?" He tilted his head, as if the answer wasn't obvious. "You know why?" He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly, a small smile playing at his lips. "You always overthink things." I stepped back, needing space, needing clarity. "And you don't think at all." He chuckled, the sound deep and knowing. "I think about what I want." I didn't reply. I couldn't. The barn behind me felt like a trap, the air between us heavy, with something neither of us should acknowledge. I knew I should leave, walk away, end whatever this was before it became something worse. But I didn't move. He took another step forward, close enough that I could see the sharpness of his jawline, the intensity in his gaze. "Tell me you don't feel it," he murmured. My pulse pounded, my breath shallow. I wanted to deny it, to pretend his words meant nothing. But the truth was far more complicated. "I won't do this," I said finally, forcing the words through clenched teeth. He studied me for a long moment before nodding. All right. It should have ended there. But the way he said it, the way his lips curved as he turned away, I knew this wasn't over. And deep down, a part of me feared that I didn't want it to be. The storm rolled in without warning, heavy raindrops pelting against the barn roof as the wind howled through the trees. I had come out to secure the doors, but before I could finish, Daniel appeared, soaked from the downpour, his shirt clinging to his frame. "You shouldn't be out here," I said, gripping the latch. He ignored the warning, stepping inside and shaking off the rain. "Neither should you." The space between us felt too small, the air thick with tension that had been building for days. I turned to leave, but he blocked my path, his presence overwhelming. "I tried to stay away," he admitted, his voice low. "But I can't. Daniel, don't." He reached for my hand, his touch burning through my skin. "Tell me you don't want this." I should have pushed him away. I should have walked out without another word. But my body betrayed me, frozen in place, heart hammering against my ribs. The rain pounded harder outside, drowning out the sound of my breathing, the sound of every warning screaming in my head. Yet, when he pulled me closer, I didn't resist. The kiss was inevitable, a mistake that had been waiting to happen. His lips were firm, urgent, and for a fleeting moment, I let myself get lost in it. But as quickly as it started, reality crashed down like the storm outside. I shoved him away, stepping back as if distance could erase what had just happened. "This is wrong," I whispered, breathless. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. "Then why didn't you stop me?" I had no answer. Shame burned in my chest, twisting into something unbearable. I turned away, pressing a hand to my forehead. "This can't happen again," I said, more to myself than to him. But when I looked back at him, I saw no regret in his eyes. Only certainty. I fled before he could say another word, the storm raging behind me. But the real damage had already been done. The house felt different after that night. Every room carried the weight of what had happened, and no matter how much I tried to pretend, I couldn't erase it. I avoided Daniel at every turn, speaking only when necessary, keeping my distance as if that would undo the mistake. But he didn't make it easy. Days passed, and he remained unchanged, unapologetic, unaffected. If anything, he seemed more certain, as if he had been waiting for me to come to terms with what he already knew. That we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I wasn't willing to accept that. One afternoon, I packed my bags. Leaving was the only way to set things right, the only way to reclaim the part of myself I had lost behind that barn. As I zipped the last suitcase, Daniel appeared at the door. "You're running," he said, leaning against the frame. I didn't look at him. "I'm leaving." "It's the same thing," I sighed, gripping the handle of my bag. "I should have left sooner." He stepped forward, but I held up a hand. "Don't." For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. A flicker of realization. Maybe even regret. "This meant something to you," he said quietly. "You can't pretend it didn't." I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "That's exactly why I have to go." Silence stretched between us, the finality of my words settling in. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't argue. Instead, he nodded, accepting what we both knew was inevitable. As I drove away from the farm, I felt the weight begin to lift. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still mine to decide. And I knew one thing for certain: I would never look back.